students, welcome to the history class for standard 10. Today we can start the various causes for the first war of Indian independence. Last week we discussed about the political causes for the revolt of 1857. Today we can discuss about the socio-religious causes. Now, there are various topics under the socio-religious causes. They are interference with the social customs, apprehensions about modern innovations, policy of racial discrimination, corruption in administration, oppression of the poor, activities of missionaries, fears regarding Western education, taxing religious places, and law of property. These 9 points are come under this topic or causes, socio-religious causes. Okay, now we can start the lesson.
Now we can move to the topic. Last week we discussed about the political causes of the First War of Independence 1857. So now we can discuss socio-religious causes. Okay, we already discussed that there are various causes. There are 9 causes under this topic. First one, interference with the social customs. Can you see the board now? Okay. Some of the social reforms introduced by the British in India were aimed at improving the conditions of the people. We know that we already studied about the social reforms introduced by the British in India. All these reforms were introduced by the British for what purpose? For improving the conditions of the people of India. While introducing such reforms, the feelings of the people were not taken into consideration. We know that the people of India were, at first they were not ready to accept these kinds of reforms. And the best examples are abolition of sati, introduction of the Widow Remarriage Act, and opening of the Western education to girls. All these kinds of reforms were introduced for improving the conditions of the people of India. But the Indians or the traditional beliefs were there, so they were not, Orthodox Hindus were not ready to accept these kinds of reforms. Second point under this socio-religious causes is apprehensions about modern innovations. People were suspicious of the introduction of modern innovations like railways and telegraphs. We know that these railways and telegraphs were introduced by the British. And they introduced these innovations in India for their own purposes. For transporting their goods easily, they introduced the railways. And for communication, easy communication, they introduced a telegraph system in India. There were rumors that telegraph poles were erected to hang those who were against the British. The Orthodox Indians noted that in the railway compartments, the higher caste and the lower caste were made to sit side by side. They believed that the British had introduced such practices to defy their caste and religion, because at that time there prevailed caste discriminations. Caste system prevailed here in India at that time. So the Orthodox Hindus were not ready to accept this kind of a system in India. That means they were not ready to sit side by side with the lower caste people. The upper caste were not ready. And they were suspicious of the modern innovations like a telegraph, because they believed that they were erected to hang those who were against the British rule. So these kinds of modern innovations, introduction of modern innovations were against, they believed that they were against their beliefs and customs. Then the third point is policy of racial discrimination. We know that the Britishers considered themselves as the superior most race. They considered Indians as the inferior class. They were white people and they considered Indians as black people. And because of this racial discrimination, they followed the policy of contempt. British officers were rude and arrogant towards the Indians. They had a belief that they had a civilizing mission, because they believed that Indians were uncivilized and they were civilized. And because of this reason, civilizing mission, they showed this kind of an arrogant and rude attitude towards the Indians. Then the next point is corruption in administration. Most of the British officers, especially police and petty officials of the British, were corrupt. And the rich got away with crime, but the common man was looted, oppressed and tortured. These kinds of petty officials and police looted, oppressed and tortured the common man. So common man had to face so many problems. So they revolted against the British. And the next point is oppression of the poor. The complex judicial system enabled the rich to oppress the poor. At that time, judiciary always supported the rich people. Rich people like zamindars, landlords, then the money lenders, etc., etc. So all these judicial rules were against the common man. And flogging, torture and imprisonment of cultivators for their inability to pay the arrears of rent, land revenue and interest on debt were quite common. Thus, the growing poverty made the poor desperate and led them to join the general uprising in hope of improving their lot. That means the common man or the poor man started revolt, or they joined the uprising because of their poverty and torturing from the rich people like money lenders and landlords. Then the next point is activities of missionaries. The British were different from Indian race, religion and sentiments. In the 18th century, the British showed friendly attitude towards the Indians or the Indian religions. But later, the British began to interfere with the local religions and social customs. They denounced idol worship and dubbed the local beliefs as ignorance. At the beginning, they showed a friendly attitude towards the Indian religions, but later they showed or they interfered in the religious matters of the Indians. After 1813, there was an increase both in the numbers and activities of the Christian missionaries. The Indians thought that the government was supporting the missionaries who would convert them to Christianity. The traditional Indians or traditional Hindus believed that these Christian activities, the missionary activities were here for converting them to Christianity, and the British government were always giving support to these kinds of missionary activities. Then, seventh point is fears regarding Western education. We know that when the Britishers came here, they were not able to communicate with the Indian people. So they introduced the Western education or English education in India. For what purpose? For getting the communication easier. And the Western system of education was introduced in a number of schools. They started so many English medium schools, and at the same time they introduced the English as the medium of study. And in 1829, the Bengal government established an English class in the Calcutta Madrasa, which was a Muslim institution. Later, English classes were introduced in Benares Sanskrit College. The shifting of emphasis from Oriental learning to Western education was not received well by the people, especially by the Pandits and the Maulavis. Pandits they taught Sanskrit in Indian schools and colleges, and Maulavis they taught their language, Urdu, etc., in their own institutions. So they were not ready to accept these kinds of Western education in India. They saw in it an attempt to discourage traditional Islamic and Hindu studies. People started suspecting that the aim of Western education was not to promote literature and science, but to encourage their children to become Christians. They feared that, these Pandits and Maulavis feared that the introduction of Western education become a major cause for the decline of their traditional culture, and it became a major cause for the introduction of Christianity to India. That was another cause for the revolt of 1857. Then the next point is taxing religious places. We know that when the Britishers came here, or before the coming of the British, in India there were so many petty rulers, and monarchy prevailed here in India. And all these monarchs they always supported their religion, and they always stood for their religion. So they were not ready to introduce or impose taxes upon these the lands of these religious institutions. We know that during that time, most of the religious institutions owned lands. These rulers, the rulers or monarchs, they gave land to these religious institutions. And these institutions or religious institutions, they hadn't give any tax to the government. But when the Britishers came here, the religious sentiments of the Indians were hurt by the official policy of taxing lands belonging to temples and mosques. Such lands had been exempted from the taxation by previous Indian rulers. The families depended on these lands began to propagate that the British were trying to undermine the religions of India. That was the belief of the traditional Hindus and Muslims. So they wanted to revolt against the British. And the next or the last point under the socio-religious causes was law of property. The Religious Disabilities Act of 1850 changed the Hindu law of property. It enabled a convert from Hinduism to other religions to inherit the property of his father. The Hindus regarded this as an incentive to give up one's religious faith. That means, earlier, if a person converted to Christianity, definitely were not given any property right over his father's property. But when the Britishers came, they introduced a new law, Hindu law of property. According to this law, all the converted Hindus were given right over his father's property. That was also considered as a faith or a system against their religious faith. All these 9 points are the socio-religious causes of the first war of Indian independence. Now we can move to the economic causes. The most important reason for the popular discontent was the economic exploitation by the British. The economic exploitation took the following forms. Mainly, there are 8 points under this economic cause. They are exploitation of economic resources, drain of wealth, decay of cottage industries and handicrafts, economic decline of peasantry, growing unemployment, inhuman treatment of indigo cultivators, poverty and famines, and decline of landed aristocracy. The first one is exploitation of economic resources. We already discussed that earlier India was an agrarian country, completely an agricultural country. Agricultural India was made an economic colony to serve the interests of the industrial England. When the Britishers came here, they wanted to collect raw materials for their industries. You already studied about the Industrial Revolution, and this revolution started in England. You know that. They set up so many factories in England, and these factories needed more and more raw materials. Mainly, there were textile industries. So they needed cotton and indigo for their factories. So they wanted to collect these raw materials from India. So India was forced to export at cheaper rates raw materials like raw cotton and raw silk that the British industries needed urgently. Plantation products like indigo and tea, and food grains which were in short supply in Britain. This was the major type of exploitation by the British. That means they collected these raw materials at a cheaper rate from India. This was one of the causes for the revolt of 1857. That means these farmers became in debt, they were in poverty, so they started a revolt. Then the second point under this economic cause is drain of wealth. What do you mean by drain of wealth? We know that the Britishers exploited India economically in different ways. That means they collected raw materials at a cheaper rate and they sold the finished products in our local markets at a higher price. Mainly in these two ways, they exploited India. And at the same time, the salaries of the officials and the expense of the army, all these were collected from the Indian economy. And they spent this these amounts not in India, in their own country, England. So, the transfer of wealth from India to England, for which India got no proportionate economic return, is called a drain of wealth. They drained our wealth. That means they drained the wealth of India to England. That is called the drain of wealth. The drain included the salaries, incomes and savings of the Englishmen, the British expenditure in India on the purchase of military goods, office establishment, interest on debts, unnecessary expenditure of the army, etc., etc. Because of this drain of wealth, so many sections of Indian society became poor. They were in poverty. So they joined in the uprising. Then the third point. Third point is decay of cottage industries and handicrafts. Heavy duties on Indian silk and cotton textiles in Britain destroyed Indian industries. We already studied that India is an agrarian country, but at the same time there were some handicrafts industries in India. But when the Britishers came here, they destroyed our traditional industries and handicrafts. On the other hand, British goods were imported to India at a nominal duty. By the middle of the 19th century, export of cotton and silk goods from India practically stopped. That means our traditional industry almost completely declined. And the art of spinning and weaving, which for ages had given employment to thousands of artisans, they became extinct. They had to convert to agriculture. So they joined in the revolt. And the next point is economic decline of peasantry. The peasants were discontent with the official land revenue policy. We know that the peasantry that bore the heavy burden of taxes to provide money for the trade of the company. Company needed more and more money. They collected more and more money from India in different ways. And one such way was the heavy burden of tax upon the peasantry. The peasants had to give heavy taxes. In Bengal, the land revenue was double the amount collected under the Mughals. And the increase in the land revenue forced many peasants into indebtedness and into selling their lands. And the traditional zamindars were replaced by the merchants and money lenders. Because of the indebtedness, most of the peasants had to sell their property or sell their land. And the rich people like merchants and money lenders became the new zamindars. And the traditional zamindars and traditional peasants became evicted from their land. So they joined in the revolt for getting their condition, for improving their conditions. Then the fifth point. It is growing unemployment. That already we discussed. That means we already discussed that the peasants, the merchants, the traditional handicraft, then the traditional industries, all these were in a poor condition. All these declined. Because of the policies of the British, the people worked in these sections become poor and they become jobless. The traditional rulers had given financial support to scholars, preachers, and men of art. The coming of the British led to the decline of such rulers, and gradually their patronage came to an end. Traditional rulers gave full support and financial support to these sections, but when the Britishers came here, the rulers lost their land or rulers lost their country. So these sections, scholars, preachers, and men of arts lost their support. The next point is inhuman treatment of indigo cultivators. Indigo trade was highly profitable to the British, but the conditions under which the peasants had to work were inhuman. We already discussed that the Britishers collected indigo from the cultivators at a lower price, and at the same time they had to work for very long time, and the peasants were forced to cultivate only indigo in their field. Earlier they cultivated food crops, but now they were compelled to cultivate cash crops like indigo instead of food crops. This was another important cause. Next point is poverty and famines. British economic exploitation, decay of indigenous industries, high taxation, the drain of wealth, stagnation of agriculture, and exploitation of the poor peasants reduced the Indians to extreme poverty. All these sections became in a poor condition. Farmers ravaged the country in the second half of the 19th century. There were 12 major and numerous minor famines between 1765 and 1857. All these famines were the result of drought, other natural calamities such as bad administration. The British government did nothing to lessen people's misery. What is famine? Famine, it is the non-availability of all the essential items, essential commodities. And people became in a poor condition, and together with that there happened so many major and minor famines. The condition of the people became very, very pathetic. But the Britishers were not given any concessions to the people. At that time also, during the famine also, Britishers collected heavy taxes or imposed heavy taxes on the poor people or peasants. So this common man joined in the revolt. And the final point under this economic cause is the decline of landed aristocracy. The landed aristocracy, which included the talukdars and hereditary landlords, they were deprived of their estates. According to the provisions of the Inhuman Commission, 20,000 estates were confiscated when the landlords failed to produce evidence like title deeds by which they held the land. There were no title deeds with them. That means there were no title deeds with the traditional landlords and talukdars. Hereditary condition prevailed there. They got their land hereditarily. And because of this Inhuman Commission, most of these traditional landlords or hereditary landlords and talukdars lost their land. Britishers confiscated all these lands under them. and these confiscated lands were sold by public auction to the higher bidders. Such estates were usually purchased by the merchants and moneylenders because now they were the rich classes in the society, and they became the new landlords. And these merchants and moneylenders did not understand the needs of the tenants and they exploited them. This drove the landed aristocracy to poverty without benefiting the peasantry, which suffered under the weight of the exorbitant land revenue. So, this was another important cause for the revolt of 1857. Okay, these were the major points under the economic causes. Now, today we discussed 2 points, that they are socio-religious causes and economic causes.
Now it's time to wind up our today's class. Here today we discussed about the socio-religious causes of the First War of Independence, and earlier we discussed, in the last class we discussed about the political causes, and in the next class we can discuss the various other causes for the revolt of 1857.